Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
And I think especially when you're working with people with, developmental disabilities, in order for them to kind of make their choices and have all the information, it does require a lot of support from the community to be like, this is all the information, and a lot of and trust in the community.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 65, where it's time to break out that great pumpkin, Charlie Brown. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Germ Lynn about their book, What You Call. Germ Lynn is a writer and cellist living in Brooklyn. As a journalist, they have been published by Playboy, Broadly, and Slate. Their short fiction has been published by Hypergraphic Press in the queer literature anthology Spaces We Have Known. And their poetry has been published by Trapart Books in the collection Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Their science fiction chapbook, What You Call, is out now on Radix Media. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster, and I'm very excited to be here today with Germ Lynn, author of What You Call. Germ, say hello.
Hello.
Yay. Thanks so much for joining me on this beautiful Sunday afternoon in Brooklyn, New York. We're here at the Central Library, always a favorite place of mine. But we're here today to talk about this amazing book. So I always like to have the author in their own words kind of kick us off by talking about the story of the book. So Germ, just tell us, what is this book? What's it all about?
So in this story, there is a robot that's programmed to care for somebody who is vulnerable, but the government needs them for another end, and so there's a recall. And because this robot wants to continue to care for the person and be present in their life, they are sort of evading government capture.
Yeah. And so just to jump back a bit before we really get into that plot and the interesting things that you break apart within that, I really like to know a little bit more about the creative process. So what was it like for you writing this and putting the story together?
Well, at the time, I was a full-time direct support professional, which is a term, it means to provide care for somebody. It's a minimum wage job. It's an entry-level job. But the boundaries of what you do are very fluid because it could be, you're trained to recognize a seizure and to intervene in that medical way, but you're also trained to be sort of a peer support and provide a lot of emotional and psychological care, but in this very sort of low grade way. Like, you're also trained to make referrals to people who can provide much more extensive supports, but you're basically the person that's there. So it involves a lot of presence. And at the level that I was doing it when I wrote this book, I was basically working more than 60 hours a week, and I was working in a home as a live-in care worker.
Yeah.
And when the person I was providing care for would go to their day program and have support during the day, I also took on a part-time job at a day program, and I would go work in a day program and then come home and work with them. So it was basically like around the clock care.
Yeah, you were with them the whole time.
Yeah, I mean,
Wow.
we were separate from each other because I kind of conceived of it as like I'm going to work and they're going to work because their day program was like an art studio, and
I see.
they identify as like an artist, and they are a very talented artist. So that's, I'm not trying to say anything different. Like they are an artist. So we weren't together necessarily per se, but it's the dynamic in which this piece was written was where I was kind of outwardly providing care as a profession almost around the clock, and I did not have really a space of my own because I lived with them in their home. So there wasn't a lot of room for the self. And when I found a little bit of room for the self, I joined a writer's workshop. And that's where the story was conceived and workshopped. And it was obviously a lot of personal experience wound its way in there. But the sense of urgency that comes off in the story, that is directly tied to basically I have like 1 hour with these people to talk about this. And there was a therapeutic sort of sense in which I engaged with the workshop. And so I felt really compelled to write to make it worth the time I had to carve out. So the sense of urgency that comes in the story was very much in the process.
Wow, that's incredible. And I can't imagine a job like you're describing being kind of a minimum wage job. Like it sounds like just a crucial, important job in someone's life that we should sort of, compensate fairly. So that's interesting to me. Like that level of support is just thought of as just, oh, that's just something. It sounds like it's thought of as just like an ancillary something, and I wonder, like, do you feel like that has stayed the same, or do you feel like there's been more recognition given to people in that line of work?
There's been a movement to raise the minimum wage across a lot of different sectors.
Yeah.
And I saw a lot of traction in fast food. A lot of fast food workers organized to raise the minimum wage. And similarly, in this field, direct support professionals and honestly, mostly the people they support advocated for their staff. And the people they support said, we want not a staff that is struggling. We want a staff that's thriving and is, not going to go away the second that a higher paying job presents itself. So we need to raise the wage and incentivize good people to stay and provide consistent supports. So there is a movement to change that. It just requires the state to make room in the budget. And so, yeah, there's a bit of a wall that has to be overcome. But I do believe, while I think it's very important work and should be compensated fairly, there are just so many crucial jobs that aren't compensated fairly.
Yeah, I know.
And we can get into why that might be, but my theory is that like care work and like domestic work, it's got this like long historical sort of this history attached to it where it's for people who are otherwise marginalized. And so that's what, they're up against is it's not just about the work, it's about the people who do the work.
Yeah, it's sort of almost like a form of subjugation to some degree. That's really interesting. So I want to think about, for you, you were mentioning you went to this writer's workshop. I mean, talk about what that was like, and maybe what was the hardest part about writing within that circumstance?
Well, definitely carving out the space, and sort of allowing myself to have the experience and not judge it because it came at a cost. I had to kind of put the cost out of my mind. Like, I could be working and making money right now, or I had to get like pretty explicit permission to like change my schedule for 6 weeks, and was kind of in a position where I felt like I was asking for something. I was like inconveniencing. So showing up to the room, knowing that it came at a bit of a cost, and letting myself just put that on the back burner and explore and play, that was probably the hardest part of navigating that space.
Yeah. I think that's difficult for a lot of people doing creative work. So I'm glad that you were able to kind of navigate those waters and end up with the book. And part of what I liked about this was the illustrations as well. And there's sort of these beautiful attached illustrations. And I noted Alma had done these illustrations. So I just kind of wanted to check in and learn a little bit about what that was like for you. How did the two of you interact with one another? Did you write first and then the illustrations? Did you kind of work together? How did that happen?
So when I submitted this story to, there was a call for submissions from Radix for science fiction, and I submitted it. It's a big part of my creative process to work to a deadline or to work within a prompt. So that really motivates me and inspires me. I'm not the kind of writer who like carries around a notebook and is like just observing and, ready to be inspired. I would love to do that. I have to make that a practice. But I went to school for journalism, so I'm much more of a writer that might have an idea that they want to work through, but like I try to inject stakes whenever possible to keep the motivation going. And knowing that this call for submissions had a deadline and they had a specific vision, that really helped me to write the story. And once it was all done, once, Radix contacted me and said they wanted to print it, they asked if I knew any illustrators, and I immediately thought of Alma. I had commissioned Alma for a self-portrait, and so I had that experience with Alma where they're responsive, they're on top of things. I used to be I still am a musician, but I used to be one too.
Yeah.
And but like in collaborating with musicians, like it's maybe kind of like an inside joke, but you can almost expect that people aren't going to be on top of it. Like you send a lot of like follow-up emails, like can you book this? Can you send me that file? And it's very loosey-goosey collaborative world.
Sure.
But with Alma, like I knew that the sort of follow-up and the follow-through was there, and I had always liked their work. They always had a sort of science fiction feel to me, even though none of that, if you look at their work, it's so varied, like between watercolor and illustrations. They've illustrated other books before, so they have that skill to kind of bring a world to life. And if you look at their work, like none of it is like explicitly science fiction, but she has a very good understanding of how to bring a world to life, and also we connect aesthetically on some things. Maybe both being from Florida and being inspired by nature. And so I just knew that they would be a good fit. And throughout the process, it was like a real exercise in trust, because I told Alma and the art director, Sarah, that I wanted the conversations and negotiations to happen between them, and I wanted to be surprised, and I knew it would turn out great, and that's what happened. I kind of divorced myself from really any involvement in the art direction, because I knew I was dealing with two experts.
Right.
And
let them go be great.
Yeah, that's exactly how I viewed it. And I got a lot of great surprises at the end. Like I didn't know that Radix was also creating this like in-world poster, like a poster that people could put on their wall, but would have come from the world that I created. It was like a propaganda poster for the independence.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, I guess that's like the perks of like, being published at like a print shop. Like they're making a lot of
They
cool
have
things.
capabilities.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's really exciting. Yeah. So now that we've kind of touched all those points, and it was really interesting to me to hear about your background and how it connected to the story. That's not something, I would have picked up on. So I kind of want to hear from you, like who is this character, the caregiver? And it's interesting. There's not a name, it's this entity, and it's that from that perspective that we kind of see this world of humans. So just to kind of start us off, when we start the story, who is this caregiver in your mind?
I definitely drew upon a lot of personal experience and was working through a lot of feelings. I felt kind of engaging in this work the way I was, that I wanted something to change. And, I hope that even though it's kind of like a vision of the future, I'm really not trying to be prescriptive or make, any kind of predictions about how things should be. I was just trying to create a world in which I could explore some of my feelings and my questions about the way in which care should be administered. Because the job, this like entry-level minimum wage job, yes, there is training and there's best practices and there's a lot of good judgment that comes down to like sort of, basic, I don't want to say common sense because I don't believe there's any common sense, but like it comes down to making, an ethical judgment. But that still left for me a lot of room to think through like how things could be better or how things are, why they are this way. So I kind of approached the story like that, like to kind of work through a bunch of feelings and to figure out like what's on my mind. And one of the questions that came to me a lot, like, so with the vulnerable people in our lives, like who is responsible? Like, and, we want to create a world where somebody has the most agency as possible and the information to make decisions about their lives. But then there's also, kind of conflicting views. And we have this history where we went from, if there's like a vulnerable person in the community, like the people who are most proximal to them, they're responsible. Their family is responsible. And then, skip ahead in history a little bit, and then it's like, oh, the state should be responsible. The state should, provide some sort of supports. And then I guess like that tension of like who's responsible is something I kind of wanted to suss out in my head a little bit, because what I believe is like we're all responsible. If there's a vulnerable person in your community at any point, you could be in a position to provide care, and at any point you could be in a vulnerable position to receive care. So sort of the caregiving and the caretaking, or the receiving of care, and how it's playing out not just in the sort of sector that I have experience in, but also interpersonal relationships and institutions as they remain. I think that dynamic should be maybe teased out a little bit and treated like a dynamic that, you're not just one-dimensional on the side of need and one-dimensional on the side of have. There's supposed to be interdependence and exchange. And, yes, like maybe we have state programs that make that exchange possible, but also, and maybe if a personal relationship like love might make that possible, but in what ways, for everything in between, in what ways are we all responsible for making that possible?
Yeah, that's really fascinating to think about. I think especially because of the differences that you can see across cultures as well, where, I visited South Korea several years ago, and the dynamics of caregiving there, I think, is totally different in that, like, the family is still responsible. You have many multi-generational households still. There's not, and I don't know if that's changed now, but when I visited, there was still a very strong culture of everybody takes care of everybody. And, here We may, like you said, there's kind of the state does it. We may, ship our elders to, nursing homes or wherever else, and there's that separation, and we're not actually living with them and dealing with them. So I think that's a interesting split to think about, across our futures and to see, is that what's going to end up happening elsewhere, or are those cultures where that's not happening yet? Are they going to maintain that inclusion, I guess?
Right. And something I think about now that I have a little bit of experience under my belt as a direct support professional is I'm definitely way more sensitive to spaces, especially spaces such as this that can be an accessibility hub. That's where I think the state, like kind of putting all the responsibility on the state, like it does come up short, because the access is there like on a regulatory level, but is it there on a community level? Is the emotional support there? Is this a place that people would want to be if they, felt like they needed to vocalize or they had, something going on? So I'm sensitive to that aspect too, of, yes, like maybe state programs can get us, so far, but at the end of the day, like it's kind of on the people who inhabit a space to make it accessible. Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting point you made about the kind of caregiving and caretaking dynamic. And I think the caregiver, so I sort of labeled this character the caregiver for lack of a better term, but I'm almost questioning that now because the way you brought that up, the beginning of the story, this entity, has this, wants to take care of Moss, this character. That's kind of the programming. It's above everything else, make sure you're taking care of Moss. And as it proceeds through the story, it's trying to find Moss, it's trying to figure out what happened and take care of Moss. It becomes a caretaker, I think, to some degree. It meets various groups, it needs things, it receives some sort of like a booster device or something from someone to help it send messages. So I think it completes this journey where it is both in all of those things and trying to navigate this environment where it's not quite sure what it is anymore.
Right. And that's something I came into the field of working with people with disabilities. I think like how a lot of people come into it, wanted a different job. I used to be in like social media marketing and just completely lost all meaning or a reason to do that. So I decided to have a career change and start over. And I'm like, okay, if you're starting over, like this is an entry-level position, like this is kind of where you start. But then once I got a little experience under my belt, I started to think that, this could be me, like at any time. Like I could get into an accident at any time. And so that always just like struck me about kind of how we sort of engage with like disability narratives. I think that people maybe when they think of it, they think of something that's like, developmental or like, born like this, always had this sort of, always had this with them. And I think if you're able-bodied, you don't really imagine a world in which you're not.
Yeah.
But I don't see why people don't imagine it because it could happen anytime. Well,
it's probably scary, right? I mean, I assume people don't, it's like the same reason we don't think about death very often. It's a crucial part of life and it informs decisions for sure, but it probably doesn't inform as many decisions as it could until we're much closer to it and we really start to see it within our friends and family, at least for me. And so I wonder if it's just people's natural distaste towards thinking about things that are uncomfortable that makes them kind of want to focus on other. I mean, it's funny because as I'm saying it, I'm like, well, people focus on other people's discomfort. We read the news about the bad things happening, but maybe not imagining ourselves. We don't like to focus the lens inward. Maybe that's more it.
Well, I think there's probably a lot of this like sort of undercurrent of ableism where you don't want to be in need. Like there's probably still a lot of long-standing stigma and narratives about being a burden or being or needing accommodation. So actually, this is something I think about. I really don't like the term special needs because it makes it feel to me like, and I won't take credit for this line of thinking, like self-advocates, they don't like the term either. And, that's where I'm getting my information is from people who are living the experiences. And, they have pointed out, like, what we're advocating for is not housing. We don't want to be discriminated against in housing and in employment. And we want better education that suits our needs. And what about housing and education or infrastructure, like a subway that is actually accessible? What about that as like special needs? How come for everybody else those are human needs?
Yeah. So would the idea be then not so much to build housing to accommodate their needs, but that all housing should be built for everyone's needs in the first place? Is that the right reframing?
I mean, I like that idea. I think all housing should be built for everyone's needs. There should be, accessibility, when you're approaching any like physical structure, how to access a physical structure. But I think probably the bigger problem is like discrimination.
Yeah.
I have had experiences where with families who are looking for apartments for their adult children to live independently. And, independently to these families means they probably have a lot of people visiting. They probably have natural support, but, this is their house and they have a door with a lock on it and they're not constantly sort of in this position of being like surveilled and like, they have a measure of privacy, or they're not living in a group home where there's not really privacy in a similar way. And they've just expressed that kind of, hitting the housing market and like meeting with landlords and like, this is, my son. And, I think is really hard to prove that they're being discriminated against for a disability. But I think that's probably the more insidious problem.
Yeah. And to kind of connect it here in terms of our protagonist and what happens to them, at some point they sort of, I don't know, I don't know now if I would phrase it like as a disability, but they certainly, so I wanted to mention this idea when they lost an arm, right? So this is a robotic entity, it fights off a human attacker, loses an arm, and then takes one of the human arms and attaches it to itself. And I thought that was a very interesting moment, with the idea that, at first I was thinking about it like, is that like a downgrade? Is that now, because it has a human arm, is that a disability for the robot? And it's perceived differently in the world, I think, too, by the people it runs into because they notice that and then they look at it. And so for me, I guess I wanted to ask about that just in terms of what happens to kind of our hero there, and what that means for its life. And then just about the blending of kind of human and machine. And if you kind of wanted to raise any significance around that in your mind.
So I think that the intentions in which I wrote this is now different than the intentions in which I'm talking about it, because I've had the benefit of getting a lot of different perspectives now than when I wrote this, in this kind of like pressurized environment of a workshop. And, when I was dealing with so much and I just wanted to get some thoughts on paper, so I think the sort of motivation for including that scene, it's just a little obscure to me, but having had time to think about it, I think I like it. I like that scene as sort of a very human thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that, you know, I am not a philosopher, and I'm also not an avid science fiction reader. So when I'm kind of mashing these like symbols together, a lot of the stuff about, like, what does technology mean for the future of humanity, and or like how do we define life, or like all of that very, very heady stuff I really wasn't thinking about. But
just fine. You were just telling a story.
Right.
Yeah.
But, you know, I feel insecure about it now. I think science fiction is a very intimidating genre to be included in, because I think that people presuppose that you did do a lot of that homework. And I must admit on air that I did not. Like, I was very much compelled by sort of my human feelings. And I think I like that gesture as a human thing to do, because sometimes when we are experiencing grief, or loss, or we're in a state of displacement or shock, doing something that doesn't seem beneficial to you, I think that's something that I can relate to as a person, where it's like, I kind of just wanted the gesture of this. And I think that the protagonist says, like, it makes me feel close to you to, like, you know, have this flesh.
When it's talking to Moss or trying to communicate with Moss.
Right.
Yeah,
or trying to communicate. It makes me feel
feels this
closer
intense longing and loss from not being able to fulfill its programming. And so it's interesting, to think about it like that. Like, anything it can do to be close to the person that it's dedicated itself towards.
And also, like, they're just like thrust into this a completely different landscape. Like, we, you know, in the story more is revealed at the end, but, you know, at the end of the story, it's like, okay, so your life has been fairly short and fairly small. Like, you've lived in a domestic realm all your life, and this domestic realm was kind of centered on taking care of somebody, and now you're thrust into a situation in which, like, you have to think about survival, like, which is, and also, like, I was interested in, like, this sort of robotic concept of death, where it's like, it's always a possibility. Like, they can lose charge and power down, and then they will cease to have animation, but they don't really experience, like, death per se, because we don't know if they have a soul, and they don't seem to be concerned about having a soul. But death can always be overcome if they can get a charge. So they have a very long life, but a very sort of conditional one.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I always think about the vocabulary we use now, even like with our phones. Like, my phone died. You know, like, it's not like your phone didn't die, because you can plug it back in and it comes back to life. Or at least if it died, it's different than, you know. So it's funny to me that we even use that term to talk about things that in fact can come back to life.
And so, like, yeah, I think that it happens earlier on in the story, and it kind of betrays maybe a sort of somebody thrust into a situation that they're not emotionally prepared for, and making some sort of emotional gesture that doesn't make sense to the outside. And it also kind of it also acquaints them with death in a very, like, basic way, in which now they are rotting flesh. That's a part of their body now, is you know, flesh that is dead. So,
right, and they caused the death. And later in the story, there's sort of the robot kind of feels defensive about it. You know, it's somebody else assumes, did you go crazy and just kill that thing? And it's like, no, I was defending myself. You know, I didn't want anything bad to happen to anyone. And so I feel like it's also some sort of like a reminder about the incident and what happened that's always kind of staying there with you.
Right. And I think as this character comes into consciousness, one of the sort of what's like grounding their consciousness is guilt and loss. And That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to make any sort of, again, a proclamation about like those are the emotions that kind of ground us. But for some existences, like they're far more pronounced than they should be. And that's just something that's like my dead arm. Like I want to carry with me, like at least a reminder of people who live in that world.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. I meant, retroactively.
Yeah. That's totally fine. So yeah, I think you said a phrase there that is really interesting to me, which is the idea of kind of becoming conscious, or I forgot exactly what you said, but like emerging itself into consciousness, because that's a really interesting way that I hadn't thought about till now, thinking about what happens to the character. And we were quickly talking about this beforehand, but there was a moment where you kind of have this character, and this character is admiring the beauty of a woman, and there's just some space within the story, within all this madness and running around and searching for people and everything, where it's like, we're going to take a few minutes here, and wow, that person is really attractive and beautiful, and I want to engage with that. And to me, that's so that's an emotional moment in the story, at least for me. And so I was trying to think about, I wrote this question about how that might make us kind of look in the mirror and think about us and our ability, if we're programming that into something else, how does that make us think about our ability to empathize? But maybe we're not. I mean, so it sounds like maybe what you're getting at is we sort of actually programmed this with a certain function to be a good caregiver. And then there was a recall, and it was sort of forced to grow up. And within that growing up, it started to change to some degree.
Yeah, and I think that moment is a big culmination of a lot of things for them.
Mm-hmm.
But there are sort of little hints on the way there that they're starting to observe things, and they're starting to observe things that they find novel or interesting. I think, early in the story, they're like, you would like it here because the trees scatter the light. And, that's a thought. Yes, it's linked to moss. Like, this is something I know that moss would like, but they're also taking pleasure in it. I think that they say that the light gives me like this feeling in my skin.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of experiencing pleasure. And I think they have these like little experiences of pleasure that are sort of, I guess, like slipping in this extremely like urgent and distressing search and hunt, and and they're kind of fighting for their life, but at the same time there's something very subtle happening where they're experiencing pleasure for the first time. And I think that experience of pleasure becomes its most lucid when they're talking with that character around a campfire, but they're also being at the same time where they have more language for what they have to do, such as I have to fight. Mm-hmm. Or like, this is the choice I'm presented with, and they're kind of conceiving of their choices in that way. This like sort of not so much programming, but more of a conscious choice. Mm-hmm. Just not only are they finally using the language in which that makes them more of a fully formed self, but they're also having these conflicting experiences where they're experiencing pleasure, but they're being confronted, like they're being made to look at themselves, because that character asks them like a lot of questions, like why,
right. And I think it also grows not just to increasing sense of self, but what it means for Moss as well. At the beginning, it seems like there's a very clear, like, my goal in life is to take care of Moss. And it's sort of like, well, what does that really mean? What does Moss want? And I think that idea of not only just saying, I need to take care of Moss, and it's within this very narrow, like, range of what taking care of means, I think the character, the protagonist, starts to expand and really try and use kind of frame of mind to think about, oh, like maybe Moss wasn't taken, maybe Moss ran away, maybe Moss doesn't want me anymore, and maybe that is what is going to make Moss happy. And if that's going to make Moss happy, maybe I shouldn't find Moss. So it's like this chain of thinking that goes beyond just modifying the self, but also being able to perceive what other people need, I think, in a different way.
Right. And I think it is kind of ambiguous because Moss is completely absent.
Right.
There's not...
We never hear.
Yeah, we never hear a
Moss.
word. I know. It makes me sad even now. I'm just like, whatever happened to Moss? We don't know.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, not a satisfying ending in that way.
Well, I know. It was, I think, I don't know if I was expecting to meet Moss after all that. So I thought it was a very satisfying ending. I'll just say, I don't want to ruin the ending, but I thought it was quite satisfying. So there was a particular line I really loved, and I just want to read it here quickly. They only saw us as shapes. They saw our bodies and drew the boundaries around them, told us how to be defined. So I don't know if you remember writing that, but I'm curious to know if you have a sense of what you were getting at there, or what that passage means either within the story or more broadly.
Well, I think in the way in which care is offered, like thinking like a health care and engaging in accessing health care, I think there are a lot of people who are told how that they can access that. So an example would be my personal experiences and conversations with people who have mental illness. We know the words to say that will get us the treatment, and we know the words absolutely not to say. There are certain things you can't tell a therapist if you don't want to get institutionalized, even if you feel them, or even if you're worried. If you want to keep yourself out of a sort of institution, you can't, or a sort of, you are now officially a danger to yourself and others situation, and as a mandatory reporter, it's my job to involve the police. You know what's not to say.
Yeah.
And so that's how I feel about, they told us how to be defined. Like, the system has its limitations, and people know how to work around those limitations to define for themselves the care that they need. I think that the people with mental illness have experience in that. So that's what I mean, like, they told us how to be defined. Like, if you kind of know the box that you need to check to get the treatment that you want, then you tell them
that.
What's in that box, but I think that's very painful, especially, and that's why I brought up the sort of analogy with accessing gender affirming healthcare. Like, it wouldn't have been enough at that time to just say, I know who I am and I know how I want to be seen by the world. You had to present yourself as somebody who is very much suffering, and so I think that that's what I mean. They tell you how to be defined, and then that's where you get the care that you need.
Yeah. So at the end of the book, Moss has sort of wished this lifetime of hard choices and freedom to fail, by our narrator. And I really loved that kind of poignant phrasing. And the narrator kind of figures out that's what it wants for itself as well, that those hard choices, the freedom to fail. So in your mind, why is that so important? And, if you have any personal examples, especially connected to your work beforehand that led to the story about the freedom to fail and hard choices, I think that was a really interesting moment in the book.
Well, I think choices are important.
Yeah.
And whether they're easy or hard, a lot of them are hard. Just because they're hard doesn't mean that people shouldn't have them. And I think especially when you're working with people with developmental disabilities, in order for them to kind of make their choices and have all the information, it does require a lot of support from the community to be like, this is all the information, and a lot of and trust in the community. And I feel like that's why they're not given a lot of choices. And it's not to do with their ability to make choices. It's the ability for the community to follow up on their end of the bargain. Like, and that's not a good reason for somebody to experience less agency, just because they're more vulnerable. So I am trying to prioritize choices in my life and frame more things as a choice. If I start getting the feeling that, well, what choice did I have? Like, that's when I know that I've entered into sort of a bad environment for me. That if I don't feel in control, like, I need to figure out a way where I can feel secure. And it's like, so why is this difficult for me? Like, let's figure out what accommodations need to be made so I feel like I am confident in my choice. And I would rather have that, like, or that sort of stepping back, that de-escalation, like putting much more work into stopping and starting again than anyone making a choice for me. And I feel like that should be offered to anyone regardless of their perceived ability.
Yeah.
So that's what I meant by hard choices and the freedom to fail. Well, sometimes make the wrong choice. Yeah. Does that mean that you can't make a choice again? Like, you shouldn't be making your own choices? Like, even if you are frequently making the wrong choices, you're just stuck in a funk or an environment where it's like you're not given a lot of great choices and your choices don't make sense to people. I think that a lot of people, they might not be making sense to you. I think the example that comes to mind is like the ways in which people can be very dispassionate towards people with drug addictions. And it's like, well, and I think they're like, well, you just like, you're given like all of the freedom in the world and you keep doing this. I'm just like, well, let's interrogate that a little bit.
Right.
Like, do they really have all the freedom in the world? Like, there's might be a reason. Like, so I think if you give people freedom to fail a lot, then it becomes clear, like, what people really need. And it might not, or maybe they're kind of like, I think I need this and that's why I do it. I like, when I say like I want hard choices and freedom to fail, it's like I really just want like more like shared responsibility.
Sure.
I don't want to be in a situation where, like, I'm not trying to say that when you make a choice that's like deemed a failure, and I'm not trying to say there's no accountability for you. Like, you're on the hook for the harm that you cause.
Sure.
But I want there to be shared responsibility into creating conditions where that's less likely to happen. Like, that seems like something that should be on everybody.
Yeah.
And so we're not, because if it's sort of like you can make choices like up until you like mess up and then like your agency is taken away in some way.
Yeah.
That's just a world that I don't want.
Yeah. Hear, hear.
I hope that it was somewhat eloquent.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, that was my set of questions, but I always like to check in. Is there anything else from the book or any other ideas, concepts, anything else you feel was important that you wanted to really get across to people?
Just that I'm still very actively engaging with the subject and I'm still trying to learn, and I want to sort of defer to people with actual lived experiences. I feel like I've sort of made analogies between some people who might have experienced this and some people who might have experienced something similar. And I do that not to simplify or invalidate any particular experience, but only to kind of maybe create connections in my mind and try to unite in my mind a sort of just like coalition for maximal agency and liberation. And and I understand that like in the sort of context of like this, 5,000 word book and this conversation that, maybe I got something wrong, but I want people to know that I'm like dedicated to learning and engaging with the subject.
Yeah, that's great. Cool. Well, all right, let's do a quick thunder round before they kick us out, and I'll learn some fast facts about you, and then we'll call it a day.
Perfect.
Okay? All right, what is your favorite food and or drink?
My favorite food is borscht, and I like it hot and cold.
Wow. Okay, awesome. All-weather food. Where is your favorite place you've ever been?
Porto, Portugal.
Ooh, okay. That sounds awesome. Was there anything in particular?
Oh, they had like this, like, they call it a cave tour, and you can like go to the other side of the river where they have all these like port cellars like in caves, and you go from cave to cave and drink port and eat sweets. So like something about being like in a cave and like eating chocolate was very Cancerian, and just very my aesthetic.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
I don't know how this would work, but I really like in The Wizard of Oz where everything turns to color. I already see in color, but if there is some way in which I can wave a magic wand and engage with the world under the world, or like see what's been there all the time and I had never seen it before, I would really, really invite that experience.
Oh, that sounds great. All right. Well, the book, again, What You Call, Radix Media published, and it is available right now. Germ Lynn, thanks so much for joining the Read, Learn, Live podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.